All right, so here's part three. Let's talk about this idea of a bottom-up effect and apply it to this concept called eutrophication. Now, eutrophication is a rapid increase in nutrients. Eutrophication is a natural process. It takes hundreds of years for it to occur naturally, but humans have introduced so much disruption and change into ecosystems that we can cause it to happen in 5, 6 years, if not less. And we are seeing this on a global scale, that we are creating some significant issues because of this bottom-up effect, this thing called eutrophication. So again, remember, look back to the last lecture. We talked about increasing phosphorus and nitrates in a body of water. Our example here was a lake. And superficially, wow, that's great. You got more phytoplankton, your producer base is bigger, your zooplankton's bigger, your herbivores are bigger. Wow, now I can catch walleye and muskie and bass and all these big carnivorous fish because that's why I'm there. So, hey, that's great. But there's a huge problem here. And let me go back here. I have a little video. It's about a 3-minute video from NOAA, and I want to show you guys what's going on with eutrophication in the Gulf of Mexico. So this is a pretty cool image of the United States. Those blue lines are showing all of the bodies of water that drain into the Mississippi River. The watershed of the Mississippi covers over 2/3 of the continental United States. It is massive. And the pinkish color, those are large urban environments. So I want you guys to think about geography. And this is Lake Michigan up here. What city would this be? We would be roughly about there. Everything we do eventually runs off into these rivers that eventually collect and contribute to the greater Mississippi watershed, the Mississippi River, and eventually dump out into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, this orangish tan glow is what's called hypoxia. There's no oxygen there. This is what we're creating, what we're doing every single year. We're creating a dead zone, which is a bottom-up effect because of how we're influencing the greater Mississippi waterway or watershed. And that's eventually running off into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's not just us. But if you look at how much of the United States contributes to this. This is a challenge. And that's why when we look at this issue in environmental science, how do we make a difference? That's the challenge. All right, let me bounce out to the video. I'm going to get that set up and we'll go through the video and talk about that. All right, so here's just some quick facts. We talked about all these phytoplankton back in Proteus. That's where a ton of our oxygen's coming from. So hopefully you guys are like, oh, I remember seeing some of those things. And they got it right. They're protists, single-celled organisms. They're not plants. There's literally thousands of them in those little droplets of water. Look familiar? We got to see some of this stuff. All right? So what scientists are doing is looking at them. Yeah, we could pull them out of a sample of pond water. We look at them in lab with the microscopes. But you can also see them from space. And the colors represent concentrations. The phytoplankton are producers. So you notice the higher concentrations are all coastal. You get into that open ocean area, there's nothing out there. There's no nutrients. That's why the phytoplankton aren't there. But you look at, and it's not just the Mississippi, but you look at all the mouths of major rivers when they dump into the oceans. They all do this, whether it's in South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, etc. Look at the east coast of the U.S. It's doing the same thing. But we're just doing a massive, massive impact upon the Gulf of Mexico. So the big chunk of the Mississippi watershed is farmland. Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Indiana, etc. That runoff, and not just farming. I'm not trying to dash or bash on agriculture. Urban farming or urban fertilizers, golf courses, etc. All that dumps into the Gulf of Mexico. Massive phytoplankton bloom. And you go, oh, that's awesome. More phytoplankton, more producers, more zooplankton, more fish, more little fish. But the problem is red tide. But then also, when all those things die, decomposition sucks out oxygen. So this is where it gets important. Here's your phytoplankton bloom. Big explosion because of the nutrients running off into the water. Zooplankton, all their poop and wastes and oh, there's a fish that we're trying to catch. Sounds great, yay! But all that waste is getting decomposed, and that is sucking the oxygen out of the water. So now you got low oxygen levels. You can't live there if you're a fish, so you leave. If you're a shrimp, you leave. But what if you're one of those mollusks we've talked about? What if you're one of those other invertebrates that can't really move out? You die, and your population goes down. So coastal waters, the Gulf Stream, moves through this area and washes this dead zone out every fall. But the problem is the zone gets bigger and it comes back every year. So while at the surface, eutrophication may seem great because, ooh, my fish population is going to grow, it's not a sustainable thing. Fast changes usually lead to problems. Slow change is what is manageable. This is happening every year, and it's getting worse every year. It's lasting longer every year. Now, how does that influence us in Illinois? Well, you like to eat shrimp or seafood that comes from the Gulf? Was there a red tide event, and is it now toxic? Or just simply the price? If the fish swim further away from shore, the fishermen have to travel further to catch them, which means increased expense, increased labor, increased fuel, which translates to higher prices when you go to the store to buy fish or you go to a restaurant to have some kind of seafood as part of your meal. So it does come back to us. What we're doing here ripples back to us economically. And as a person in agriculture, you're losing all that fertilizer. Why don't you just burn a couple $100? Why don't you just throw away a couple $100 or $1,000 if the fertilizer is not applied correctly and it washes off and winds up in these rivers that eventually lead to the Gulf of Mexico? Okay, bottom up. Now, let's look at the exact opposite, top down. We've already talked about this, but let's go back to it. Top down. All right, so a top-down effect is a factor that influences the upward trophic level. So we went through the Yellowstone issue with the wolves. Totally a top-down impact. They reduced the wolf population, killed them all, eliminated them, eliminated any residential wolves from the park in the 20s and early 30s. Elk and herbivores increased, they overbrowsed the vegetation, stream banks destabilized, etc., 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 etc. Ripple effect. That is a top-down. So again, we talked about it. We looked at it with Yellowstone. I'd encourage you guys, take a minute, read what happened here, what's going on before the wolves, what happened to the park when the wolves were gone, and then how did Yellowstone how has it changed since the wolves were reintroduced or brought back in the mid-90s? It is not back to what it was back. Yellowstone has not recovered and gone back to the 1910 biodiversity, but it's much better than it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and so on, because of the reintroduction of those wolves. That's the keystone idea when we covered that topic in our previous lecture. Okay, so again, top down, higher trophic level, ripples on down. So what often happens with a top-down effect is a thing known as a trophic cascade. So I want you guys to think about a waterfall or a series of waterfalls. I call them cascades. And what happens is when you have a factor at a higher trophic level, it flows down to lower trophic levels. I'm going to call it the ripple effect. All right, so cascading, usually the cascade flows downhill or downstream or down. So that's, again, it's kind of synonymous with a top-down effect. Just another example, when cougars were eliminated from Yosemite back in the 20s, what happened there? Same concept. Mule deer population increased. The mule deer eat black oak, drove down that population. Black oak compete with ponderosa pine. Those guys, ponderosa pine populations went up, changed vegetation. You see the pattern. That's the idea with top-down or trophic cascades. Right? So the challenge is, we're doing this all the time as a species. We're doing this. Can we as a species minimize it? Ideally, stop it. That's what conservation biology is all about. Educating people about these things. Whether it's the person using fertilizer on their lawn, it's the hunters out there wanting to shoot top-level predators, things like that. Can we make wise decisions based on science? That is what we're trying to do with conservation biology. So, all right, so the last thing to mention, let's kind of wrap up dynamics of ecosystems here with ecosystem stability. If you have species richness, you have a more stable ecosystem. That's why even though a farm field has more producer base, more energy, it does not have stability at all. You get a fungus into your cornfield, gone. Get a fungus in a prairie, prairie's still there. So stability is directly correlated with species richness. Now, when we look at richness, different things that will influence species richness will be primary productivity. What is your producer base? The diversity of your producers. Things can't survive on just one type of producer, but how much productivity do you have? How much energy is produced? But then also the diversity of producers there. Habitat. Diversity. Do you have mountains, rivers, forests, prairies, deserts? What's your habitat and your terrain? But then we also have to look at what are your climate factors? How do those influence the species richness within your community? General rule of thumb, as you move towards the equator, richness increases. Whether you're moving south or you're moving north towards the equator. So if you're in the southern hemisphere going up, you're in the northern hemisphere coming down, equatorial regions have the greatest species richness on the planet. This is why those ecosystems are so important.